At 15:30 hours on May 2nd, 1945, Major Robert Staver stood in the courtyard of a resort hotel in Reuth, Austria, watching German scientists emerge from the building with their hands raised. They wore civilian clothing. They carried no weapons. Their leader, a 33-year-old engineer with his right arm in a cast from a skiing accident, walked forward and introduced himself in fluent English. Werner von Braun, technical director of the Peenemünde rocket program, designer of the V-2 ballistic missile, SS officer, member of the Nazi Party since 1937. Staver had 127 names on his list. Scientists and engineers who had developed weapon systems that Germany hoped would win the war. Von Braun was at the top. Behind him stood Eberhard Ries, Walter Riedel, Ernst Stuhlinger, Arthur Rudolph, and 122 others. They represented the complete technical staff of the German rocket program. They had traveled over 300 kilometers from Nordhausen to surrender to American forces rather than Soviet forces. They knew what they possessed. Technical knowledge that could build rockets capable of reaching space. That knowledge was worth their freedom. Staver had orders to interview them. Instead, he cabled Washington. These men should not be interviewed. They should be extracted immediately. The Soviets were 70 kilometers away and advancing. If Soviet forces captured the rocket team, American missile development would lag by 10 years. On May 22nd, Colonel Joel Holmes transmitted the recommendation to the War Department: evacuate 100 of the 400 Germans in custody. They are important for the Pacific War effort. The Pacific War ended 3 months later. The evacuation continued anyway. The story begins in March 1945, at a toilet in Bonn University, where a Polish laboratory technician discovered pages of a document stuffed into the plumbing. The document was the Osenberg List, a classified registry of 15,000 German scientists and engineers organized by specialty and location. Werner Osenberg, a mechanical engineer working for the Reich Research Council, had compiled it in 1943 as part of an emergency program to recall technical personnel from combat units and redeploy them to weapons development. When Allied forces approached Bonn in March 1945, someone attempted to destroy the list by tearing it up and flushing it. The attempt failed. The Polish technician recovered the pages and turned them over to British intelligence. MI6 transmitted copies to American intelligence within days. Major Staver received his copy in April 1945. He was chief of the Jet Propulsion Section of the Research and Intelligence Branch of United States Army Ordnance Corps, stationed in London. His assignment was to identify which German scientists possessed knowledge essential to American weapons development and ensure they did not fall into Soviet hands. The Osenberg List provided names, specializations, and last known locations. Staver created his own list. He called it the Blacklist. The scientists on it would be interrogated. Their work would be evaluated. If their knowledge justified extraction, they would be brought to the United States under military contracts. Werner von Braun headed the Blacklist because his achievements were unique. He had led development of liquid-fueled rockets since 1932, when the German Army first hired him at age 20. By 1936, the Army had established a research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast with von Braun as technical director. By 1942, the A-4 rocket, later designated V-2, had completed successful test flights. The missile was 14 meters long, weighed 12,700 kilograms at launch, carried a 1,000-kilogram warhead, and could strike targets 320 kilometers away. Maximum altitude during flight exceeded 100 kilometers. This made it the first human-built object to reach space. Production began in 1943 at Peenemünde, after British Royal Air Force bombers struck the facility on August 18, 1943. Production moved to Mittelwerk, an underground factory built into the Kohnstein mountain near Nordhausen in central Germany. The factory occupied 2 parallel tunnels, each 1.4 kilometers long and 10 meters high, connected by 46 cross-tunnels. Construction and rocket assembly utilized forced labor from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora between August 1943 and April 1945. They came from occupied territories throughout Europe. Soviet prisoners of war, Polish political prisoners, French resistance members, Jews evacuated from Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen as Soviet forces advanced. They worked 14-hour shifts excavating tunnels, assembling missiles, and moving equipment. They slept underground in the tunnels until surface barracks were completed in December 1943. They received inadequate food, no medical care, and brutal treatment from SS guards and civilian overseers. The death rate at Mittelbau-Dora exceeded that of most concentration camps. From October 1943 to March 1944, 2,900 prisoners died out of 17,500 total. The mortality rate was 16% in 5 months. Prisoners too weak to work were transported to Bergen-Belsen or Mauthausen to be killed. Prisoners suspected of sabotage were hanged publicly. Production continued regardless of casualties. By September 1944, monthly output reached 600 missiles. Total production from 1943 to 1945 exceeded 6,000 V-2 rockets. The missiles killed approximately 5,200 civilians, primarily in London and Antwerp. Production killed at least 10,000 prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora and associated camps. Historian Michael Neufeld calculated that the V-2 program was unique among weapon systems in that twice as many people died manufacturing it as died from its use. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk at least 12 times between January 1944 and February 1945. On May 6, 1944, he met with Arthur Rudolph, production director, and Albin Sawatzky, general manager, to discuss labor requirements. Von Braun proposed recruiting 1,800 skilled French prisoners from Buchenwald to work in a laboratory. On August 15, 1944, he personally visited Buchenwald to select prisoners for transfer to Mittelbau-Dora. Documentation of this visit survived the war and was declassified in 1984. The extent of von Braun's knowledge of conditions at Mittelbau-Dora remains disputed. He testified in 1969 to a West German court that he saw terrible conditions but never saw dead bodies or sabotage reports leading to executions. Survivors reported seeing him tour the factory with SS officers. Jean-Michel, a French resistance member who worked as a slave laborer at Mittelwerk, wrote in his memoir that von Braun inspected production lines where prisoners worked in conditions that killed them within weeks. Von Braun's SS membership became public knowledge in 1961 when East German publications released documents showing he joined the SS in 1940 and achieved the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major. By 1944, American intelligence knew about his Nazi Party membership and SS rank when they recruited him in 1945. They classified the information and instructed him never to discuss it publicly. Arthur Rudolph's role was more direct. As production director at Mittelwerk from September 1943 to January 1945, he supervised manufacturing operations that employed 5,000 to 6,000 concentration camp prisoners on 12-hour shifts. He visited the factory daily. He issued production quotas. He requested additional slave labor when output fell below targets. In April 1943, while still at Peenemünde, he wrote a memo recommending adoption of SS camp labor similar to what he had observed at an aircraft factory. Prisoners arrived at Peenemünde on June 17, 1943, 3 months before production moved to Mittelwerk. Rudolph maintained until his death in 1996 that he advocated for improved prisoner treatment and increased rations. He claimed he had no authority over SS guards and could not prevent brutality. Documents show he participated in production meetings where labor requirements were discussed and approved. His signature appears on requisition forms requesting additional prisoners when production schedules demanded acceleration. Neither von Braun nor Rudolph faced war crimes prosecution. American military intelligence officers who interviewed them in May 1945 noted their Nazi affiliations but recommended extraction based on technical value. The first intelligence report on Rudolph, dated June 1945, described him as 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat, recommend internment. A second report 3 weeks later reversed the assessment. Subject possesses unique knowledge of rocket production. Technical value outweighs security concerns. Recommend recruitment. The policy change reflected strategic calculation. In May 1945, the United States and Soviet Union were allies defeating Germany. By June 1945, the alliance was fracturing. Soviet forces occupied eastern Germany and were interrogating German scientists. Intelligence reports indicated the Soviets were offering high salaries and research positions to rocket engineers who agreed to work in the USSR. American policymakers concluded that German technical knowledge would go to either the United States or the Soviet Union. Allowing it to go to the Soviets was unacceptable. Therefore, recruitment would proceed regardless of Nazi backgrounds. President Harry Truman approved Operation Overcast on July 20th, 1945. The Joint Chiefs of Staff established policy. German scientists and technicians would be brought to the United States on temporary contracts for 6 months to 1 year. They would assist with weapons development for the ongoing war against Japan. They would be screened to exclude ardent Nazis, war criminals, and security threats. After their contracts expired, they would return to Germany. The screening requirements were problematic. Approximately half the German scientists on Staver's list were former Nazi Party members. Many had joined opportunistically to advance their careers. Some were true believers who had held significant party positions or joined the SS under Truman's directive. These men should have been excluded. Intelligence officers responsible for implementing the directive faced a choice: follow the policy and lose access to critical technical knowledge, or revise the policy to permit recruitment of scientists with Nazi backgrounds. They chose revision. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, established in August 1945 to administer the program, created procedures for sanitizing personnel files, information about Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, and involvement with forced labor was removed from files or rewritten to minimize severity. Scientists who had been classified as security threats in initial reports were reclassified as acceptable risk in subsequent reports. The sanitized files were used for immigration approval and background checks. The original files were sealed. The program was renamed Operation Paperclip in November 1945. The name derived from paperclips attached to folders containing sanitized files. When immigration officials or security investigators requested information about a German scientist, they received the paperclipped sanitized version. The original version remained classified. The first group of 7 rocket scientists arrived in the United States on September 20th. Sauerdohm 45. Von Braun, Eberhard Ries, Theodor Poppel, William Schulze, Erich Neubert, Wilhelm Jungert, and Walter Schwedetzky landed at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor. From there, they traveled to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where they would work as War Department special employees developing missile technology for the United States Army. Their arrival was classified. The American public was not informed that German scientists, some with Nazi backgrounds, were working on United States military installations. The classification lasted until 1947. When journalists began reporting that German rocket engineers were living in Texas, by then, additional groups had arrived, bringing total numbers to over 127. The conditions at Fort Bliss were austere but acceptable. The scientists lived in barracks. They ate in military mess halls. They worked in facilities that were crude compared to Peenemünde but adequate for rocket research. They received monthly salaries equivalent to United States Army officers of comparable rank. Their families remained in Germany because immigration regulations did not permit dependents to accompany War Department special employees. The work focused on V-2 technology. The United States Army had captured approximately 100 complete V-2 missiles at Mittelwerk before Soviet forces arrived. Components were shipped to White Sands. Between 1946 and 1951, 67 V-2 rockets were launched from White Sands, some modified to test new technologies. The launches proved that V-2 technology could be adapted to American requirements. They also proved that the German scientists were essential. American engineers lacked experience with liquid fuel rockets. The Germans possessed institutional knowledge that would take years to replicate through independent development. In 1946, the State Department raised objections. Bringing Nazi scientists into the United States violated stated policy. Jewish organizations protested. The Federation of American Scientists, an organization of physicists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, issued statements opposing the recruitment of scientists who had participated in atrocities. Albert Einstein publicly questioned whether scientific knowledge justified overlooking moral culpability. The War Department responded that the scientists were necessary for national security. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was developing its own missile program using German scientists captured in the Eastern Zone. The United States needed technological superiority. The German rocket team provided it. Moral considerations were secondary to strategic necessity. The State Department's objections were overruled. President Truman, initially reluctant, approved permanent immigration in 1946 after being briefed on Soviet missile development. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency expanded the program. Scientists specializing in aerodynamics, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, and submarine technology were recruited. By 1947, over 700 German and Austrian specialists had been brought to the United States. By 1962, when the program officially ended, approximately 1,600 had immigrated, most eventually becoming United States citizens. The Air Force recruited more scientists than the Army. Aeronautical engineers who had designed jet aircraft, swept wing technology, and advanced propulsion systems went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The Navy recruited submarine designers and torpedo specialists. Private companies recruited chemists who had worked on synthetic fuels and industrial processes. The Army retained the rocket team, which remained the most visible group because rocketry captured public imagination. In April 1950, the Fort Bliss operation transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Von Braun and 130 Paperclip members moved to Huntsville, where they established the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Their assignment was developing nuclear-armed ballistic missiles for the United States Army. The Redstone missile, operational in 1958, could deliver a nuclear warhead 300 kilometers. The Jupiter missile, operational in 1958, extended range to 2,400 kilometers. Both missiles used technology derived from the V-2. The German scientists remained isolated from mainstream American society through the early 1950s. They worked on classified military projects. They lived in housing near Redstone Arsenal. They socialized primarily with each other. Huntsville residents knew they were Germans, but not that they had worked for the Nazi regime. The sanitized cover story presented them as rocket engineers who had been forced to work for the Nazis and had willingly surrendered to American forces to escape Soviet occupation. Von Braun cultivated this image deliberately. He gave interviews emphasizing his childhood fascination with space travel. He wrote articles for popular magazines describing the technical challenges of rocketry. He appeared on television programs hosted by Walt Disney in 1955, explaining space exploration to millions of American viewers. He became famous as a visionary scientist working to fulfill humanity's dream of reaching space. His Nazi past remained classified. In July 1954, most of the Huntsville Germans received United States citizenship. Von Braun and 103 others took the oath of citizenship at a ceremony at the Huntsville courthouse. Citizenship provided permanent resident status and ended their designation as enemy aliens. It also complicated any future effort to deport them if their Nazi backgrounds became public. The sanitization largely succeeded through the 1950s. Journalists who investigated the German scientists' backgrounds found sealed files and officials who declined to comment. The Cold War made criticism seem unpatriotic. Soviet missile development and the 1957 launch of Sputnik created urgency around American space capabilities. Von Braun and his team were positioned as essential to American success. Questioning their backgrounds seemed counterproductive. The situation changed in 1957 when Sputnik created panic about American technological inferiority. President Eisenhower authorized accelerated missile development. In 1958, Congress established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to coordinate space exploration. In 1960, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency transferred to NASA. Von Braun became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. His assignment was developing the Saturn rockets that would send astronauts to the moon. The Saturn V rocket, completed in 1967, stood 110 meters tall, weighed 3,000 kilograms at launch, and could lift 130,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. It consisted of 3 stages, each using liquid fuel engines derived from V-2 technology. The first stage had 5 F-1 engines producing 34 million newtons of thrust. The Saturn V launched 13 times between 1967 and 1973. All successful. 9 of those launches sent astronauts to the moon. The first moon landing, Apollo 11 in July 1969. Matt von Braun, an American hero. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in February 1958. He received the National Medal of Science in 1975. He was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering in 1967. He spoke at universities, wrote books about space exploration, and advocated for missions to Mars. His public image was scientist and visionary. His Nazi past remained classified. Arthur Rudolph managed the Saturn V development program. He was production director, the same role he held at Mittelwerk. He ensured that components were manufactured on schedule and assembly proceeded without delays. When the Apollo 11 mission succeeded, Rudolph received the Distinguished Service Medal, NASA's highest honor. He retired in 1969 and lived in San Jose, California, on a government pension. In 1979, Eli Rosenbaum, an attorney with the Office of Special Investigations at the United States Department of Justice, discovered references to Rudolph in a book about the V-2 program. The book mentioned forced labor at Mittelwerk. Rosenbaum researched records from the 1947 Nordhausen war crimes trials at the National Archives. He found evidence connecting Rudolph to decisions that caused deaths of concentration camp prisoners. He found the June 1945 intelligence report describing Rudolph as 100% Nazi and security threat. He found requisition forms with Rudolph's signature requesting additional slave labor. In September 1982, the Office of Special Investigations sent Rudolph a letter requesting an interview. Rudolph believed it was routine. He had been interrogated multiple times since arriving in the United States. He agreed to meet with OSI investigators. The first interview occurred in October 1982. It lasted 6 hours. Investigators asked about his attitudes on racial superiority, his Nazi Party membership, and his role at Mittelwerk. Rudolph acknowledged that he had been at Mittelwerk. He acknowledged he supervised production. He denied knowledge of prisoner deaths. He denied participating in decisions to hang prisoners for sabotage. He claimed he had no authority over SS guards. 2 more interviews followed in 1983. Investigators confronted him with documents, production reports he had signed, meeting minutes showing he participated in labor allocation discussions, testimony from Mittelwerk survivors identifying him as someone who toured the factory regularly. Rudolph's denials became less credible. By November 1983, OSI offered him a choice: face denaturalization and deportation proceedings, or sign an agreement to leave the United States voluntarily and renounce citizenship. Rudolph signed on November 28, 1983. Under the agreement, he would not be prosecuted. His wife and daughter would retain citizenship. His pension would continue. He left the United States in March 1984. He renounced citizenship as agreed. West Germany protested because Rudolph now had no citizenship anywhere. In July 1984, West Germany requested evidence from OSI to determine whether to grant citizenship or prosecute. The investigation lasted 3 years. In March 1987, German prosecutors concluded there was insufficient evidence for prosecution because the statute of limitations had expired on crimes other than murder, and OSI had not provided proof of murder. Rudolph received German citizenship. He lived in Hamburg until his death in 1996. The Rudolph case made public what had been classified for 40 years. German scientists brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip had Nazi backgrounds. Some had participated in atrocities. The sanitization of their records had been deliberate policy. The justification was national security, but the consequence was that war criminals received American citizenship and government pensions, while Holocaust survivors were denied immigration. Journalists investigated other paperclip scientists. They found that several had been members of the SS. Some had worked at facilities using forced labor. None had faced prosecution because their files had been sanitized. By 1985, the operation's full scope was documented in newspaper articles, television programs, and congressional hearings. The ethical questions were unavoidable. Had the United States government made a deal with war criminals? Did scientific knowledge justify overlooking atrocities? Were Cold War security concerns sufficient reason to ignore moral culpability? The defenders argued that paperclip was necessary. Without German scientists, the United States would have lagged years behind the Soviet Union in missile technology. The Cold War could have turned hot. Nuclear weapons could have been used. The stakes justified morally ambiguous decisions. The critics argued that principles mattered. Recruiting Nazis and covering up their crimes legitimized atrocity. It sent a message that technical competence excused participation in genocide. It undermined the moral authority the United States claimed after Nuremberg. Von Braun died of cancer in 1977, 7 years before the Rudolph case made headlines. He never faced prosecution or public accountability. His reputation remained largely intact, despite revelations about his SS membership and visits to Mittelbau-Dora. His contributions to the space program overshadowed his Nazi past in public memory. The Saturn V rocket stands at the Kennedy Space Center as a monument to American achievement. The Mittelbau-Dora prisoners who built the V-2 have no comparable memorial in the United States. The strategic assessment of Paperclip remains contested. Historian Michael Neufeld argues that von Braun saved the United States perhaps 5 years of development time on missile technology, but that American engineers would have achieved similar results independently. The Soviet Union recruited over 2,000 German scientists through Operation Paperclip in 1946 and developed competitive missile technology on similar timelines. Both superpowers reached space in the late 1950s. Both developed intercontinental ballistic missiles by 1960. The German scientists accelerated development, but were not decisive. The industrial value was significant. Patents and technical processes taken from Germany were valued at $10 billion in 1945 currency. Chemical processes for synthetic fuels, aerodynamic research on swept-wing aircraft, submarine designs using closed-cycle propulsion, infrared guidance systems. These technologies provided competitive advantages in multiple industries. The scientists who understood them were essential for exploiting them. Whether that exploitation required giving them citizenship and immunity from prosecution is a different question. The moral question has no satisfactory answer. The United States government knowingly recruited war criminals, falsified their records, granted them citizenship, and protected them from prosecution. This violated stated policy and undermined principles established at Nuremberg. The justification was national security in the context of escalating Cold War tensions. Whether national security justified those decisions depends on counterfactual assessments of what would have happened if different choices had been made. The prisoners who died at Mittelbau-Dora had no voice in these decisions. Their deaths enabled development of technology that benefited both Nazi Germany and the United States. The engineers who supervised their deaths became American heroes. This is morally indefensible regardless of strategic justifications. The Mittelbau-Dora Memorial in Germany includes the names of prisoners who died there. Over 20,000 names. They came from 21 countries. Most were political prisoners. Many were Jews. All were enslaved. All were worked to death or murdered when they became too weak to work. Their contribution to rocket development receives minimal recognition compared to the engineers who supervised their deaths. At Huntsville, the United States Space and Rocket Center displays a Saturn V rocket that visitors can walk beneath. Informational plaques describe the technical specifications and the Apollo missions. They mention von Braun and the German rocket team. They describe the team as scientists who came to America after the war. The plaques do not mention Mittelbau-Dora. They do not mention forced labor. They do not mention that approximately twice as many people died building V-2 rockets as died from V-2 attacks. The University of Alabama Huntsville Library hosted an exhibit in 2010 titled Dora and the V-2, Slave Labor in the Space Age. The exhibit documented conditions at Mittelbau-Dora and connections between the concentration camp and the Huntsville rocket team. Some Huntsville residents objected. They argued the exhibit damaged the city's reputation and unfairly criticized men who could no longer defend themselves. The exhibit remained on display but generated controversy that continues. The historical record is now complete. Operation Paperclip recruited approximately 1,600 German and Austrian scientists and engineers. Roughly half were former Nazi Party members. A significant minority had SS affiliations. Several participated in decisions that caused deaths of concentration camp prisoners. American intelligence officers sanitized their records to facilitate immigration. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower authorized the program despite ethical concerns. The justification was Cold War security competition with the Soviet Union. The program's effectiveness varied by specialty. The rocket team was highly visible and arguably accelerated missile development significantly. Aeronautical engineers contributed swept-wing technology and jet engine improvements. Chemical engineers provided synthetic fuel processes. Submarine designers improved propulsion systems. Many scientists dispersed to universities and private companies where their individual contributions are difficult to quantify. The collective impact was substantial but not decisive. American science would have advanced without them, likely at somewhat slower pace. The moral cost was acceptance of atrocity. Men who participated in slave labor programs that killed thousands received American citizenship, government employment, and public honors. Their victims received minimal recognition. The decision to recruit them despite their Nazi backgrounds communicated that technical competence outweighed moral responsibility. This undermined principles of accountability that the United States had championed at Nuremberg. The legacy persists in space programs that trace their lineage to paperclip scientists. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center was led by von Braun for 10 years. Many technologies developed there derived from V2 research conducted at Peenemünde and manufactured at Mittelbau-Dora. Separating the technical achievements from their origins is impossible. The Saturn V exists because the V2 existed. The V2 exists because 20,000 concentration camp prisoners were worked to death manufacturing it. Operation Paperclip demonstrates how states make decisions when moral principles conflict with strategic interests. The United States chose strategic interests. The choice was deliberate, documented, and defended by officials who believed it was necessary. Whether it was necessary is unknowable because the counterfactual cannot be tested. What is known is that the choice had consequences. War criminals became American citizens. Atrocities went unpunished. Victims received no justice. The men who made these decisions believed they were protecting national security. They believed the Soviet threat justified morally questionable means. They believed technical superiority would prevent nuclear war. These beliefs were sincere. They were also convenient. Sincere belief in the necessity of immoral action does not make the action moral. It makes it tragic. The 1,600 scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip are mostly dead now. Von Braun died in 1977. Rudolph died in 1996. Most others died in the 1980s and 1990s. Their contributions to American technology are documented. Their roles in Nazi atrocities are documented. Both facts coexist. Both shape their legacy. At Nordhausen, the former Mittelbau-Dora camp is now a memorial site. Visitors can tour the tunnels where prisoners assembled V2 rockets. They can see the barracks foundations where prisoners slept. They can read the names on the memorial listing prisoners who died there. The site receives approximately 50,000 visitors annually, mostly Germans fulfilling educational requirements about Holocaust history. Few Americans visit. This is the Paperclip story. Not scientists escaping tyranny. Not technical genius building a better future. Professional engineers who participated in atrocities being extracted by a government willing to overlook atrocities for strategic advantage. They succeeded because they possessed knowledge others wanted. Their victims died because they possessed no comparable value. The engineers built rockets. The prisoners built the rockets the engineers designed. One group received citizenship and honors. The other group received mass graves and neglect. The rockets flew. The principles died. This was the deal. Whether it was worth making depends on what principles cost and what security gains justify.